The galaxy remembered her name in whispers. Entire fleets had vanished under her command, and worlds had burned because she willed it. To her enemies, she was a shadow that came with the silence of space, leaving behind only wreckage and ash. To her followers, she was strength itself, a symbol of power so absolute that no one dared question it. For years, she ruled the stars not by mercy, but by fear, and every species knew the cost of standing against her. She was the most feared warrior the galaxy had ever seen. And yet, all it took was one human to stand in her way. At first, it seemed impossible. Humanity was not the strongest species. They didn't have the most advanced ships or the most ruthless armies. They were still considered newcomers to the wider galaxy, barely finding their footing among civilizations that had thrived for millennia. But they carried something different, something no empire, no fleet, no weapon could ever fully crush. They carried defiance, that raw refusal to bend even when the odds screamed they should. The first time she laid eyes on him, the warrior expected fear. She had built her reign on it. Countless soldiers had dropped their weapons at the sight of her banners. Rulers had surrendered their crowns when her ships darkened their skies. Yet this human did not lower his gaze. He did not flinch. He simply stood there, surrounded by soldiers loyal to her, and when she commanded him to kneel, he refused. It was such a small thing, so simple, but it carried weight heavier than 1,000 armies. In that silence, a line had been drawn. She felt it, the entire room felt it, the moment when fear began to crack. The human's voice, steady and unbroken, cut through the air. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, but his words held something she had not felt in centuries. They carried belief, conviction, and the promise that he would not be broken. And in that instant she felt something she had never expected. Not anger. Not triumph. Something far more dangerous. Doubt. It spread through her forces like fire hidden beneath the surface. Because if one fragile human could stand before her and refuse to bow, what did that mean for the millions still living under her rule? If one spark of defiance could exist, could it spread? Could it burn through everything she had built? She had fought wars against fleets larger than entire star systems, and she had won. She had crushed rebellions with a single strike. But this was different. She realized that no weapon could silence the human spirit. No blade could cut down defiance forever. Still, she could not let it show. Not in front of her soldiers. She raised her hand as if to strike him down where he stood, to remind everyone why she was feared. And yet, for the briefest moment, she hesitated. What? She asked herself that question, though she already knew the answer. Because she had never faced an enemy like this. Her power had always rested on fear. But fear only worked as long as everyone believed it was unshakable. And here, in the presence of a single human, she saw the cracks forming. She saw the seed of something she could not fully control. Around them, the silence stretched. Every soldier held their breath. No one moved. The galaxy's most feared warrior and one lone human stood locked in that impossible moment, neither willing to bend. And somewhere deep in her chest, for the first time in her reign, she felt the chill of uncertainty. But uncertainty was dangerous. If she faltered even for a heartbeat, everything she had built could unravel. So she lowered her hand and forced a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. She told herself it meant nothing, that one human's defiance could not change the course of empires. Yet the human saw it, the flicker in her gaze, the pause in her command. And he smiled back. Not with arrogance, but with quiet understanding. He had seen something she had never wanted anyone to see. Her fear. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. She still held the armies, the fleets, the throne carved from the bones of conquest. But he held something far more dangerous. He had shown that even the galaxy's deadliest warrior could be challenged, not by weapons but by will. And that was only the beginning. Because rumors spread faster than any fleet. Whispers carried across stars from one world to another. Stories of a human who stood unbroken before the galaxy's most feared warrior. Stories that planted seeds of courage in the hearts of others. For every person who had bowed, there was now a reason to wonder if they could stand instead. She knew it. She could feel it. And as much as she tried to bury it, she could not shake the thought that her reign, built on terror, might crumble not because of a war, but because of one human's refusal to bow. The air in the chamber seemed to tighten. Her soldiers waited for her command, unsure whether to strike or to stand down. The human's eyes never left hers, steady and unyielding. For the first time in years she felt trapped. Not by chains. Not by armies. But by a truth she could not deny. That fear, once broken, could never be put back together the same way. Her lips parted, ready to give an order that would change everything. But before the words could leave her mouth, the alarms sounded. The chamber shook. Outside, the stars lit with fire. Something had arrived, something neither she nor the human had expected. And in that sudden chaos, she realized the unthinkable. Her war was no longer against rebels, no longer against rivals, no longer against fractured worlds clinging to hope. Her war had shifted. Because now, for the first time, she faced the one thing she had never prepared for. A war against defiance itself. And it had already begun. The alarms grew louder, soldiers scrambled, and the human still stood in silence, watching her. His refusal was not just an act anymore, it was a promise. A promise that this was far from over. She clenched her fists, rage and fear twisting together inside her. For years she had believed she was untouchable. But as the chamber trembled and the human's steady gaze refused to break, she finally understood the truth. Even the strongest rule cannot last forever when one person dares to stand. And in the silence before the storm, the galaxy's most feared warrior realized something she could never admit aloud. She was no longer in control. The story was only beginning. The alarms kept screaming, echoing through the massive chamber. The sound was sharp, metallic, alive with panic, as though the very walls of her fortress had decided to betray her. Soldiers rushed to their stations, voices overlapping, weapons clattering, boots pounding against the steel floors. She didn't move. Not yet. Her eyes stayed locked on the human who still stood so impossibly calm in the middle of the chaos. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. For years, she had seen the strongest of commanders collapse in fear at the sound of those alarms. She had seen leaders abandon their thrones, begging for mercy at the first sign of an attack. Fear was always her weapon, and in moments like this, it usually sharpened. But not with him. Not this time. The alarms did not break him, and his stillness cut deeper than a scream ever could. The soldiers looked to her for orders. They were trained to wait, to follow her lead, because her voice had always been the one constant above the storms. But she hesitated, if only for a breath. And in that breath, the human tilted his head, as if to say he understood more than he should. It struck her like a wound. She finally broke their stare, turning toward the massive screens on the far wall as they flickered to life. Red warnings splashed across the panels. Enemy signatures. Not just one ship but many. A fleet. But this was no rebellion, no fractured uprising of desperate fools. The designs of the ships were unfamiliar, the patterns erratic, like nothing she had faced before. Whoever they were, they had come prepared, and they had chosen now, this moment when her grip already felt thinner than it had in centuries. She ordered the fleet to intercept, her voice steady even though her chest burned with unease. The soldiers obeyed, but not as swiftly as before. She noticed it. The hesitation. The questioning. It spread quietly, but she could see it in their movements. One human standing tall in the middle of the chamber had already started unraveling their certainty. And now, with enemies at the gates, cracks widened. The human finally spoke again, his voice calm, carrying across the chaos. Not everyone bows forever. Fear only lasts until someone decides to stand. She whipped her head back toward him, eyes narrowing. The words were poison, and worse, they were truth. She wanted to silence him, to strike him down in front of everyone, to remind them why her name carried weight across the stars. But her hand didn't move. Somewhere deep inside, the words had already taken root, and she hated herself for it. She remembered the beginning of her reign. The long years of war, the countless battles fought in the cold silence of space. She had been young then, burning with anger at the weakness of her people's rulers. They had begged for peace, compromised with enemies, and in the end, watched their worlds be swallowed by stronger powers. She had risen out of that fire, refusing to bow, refusing to let her people be erased. And she had won. But victory had cost her something. She had buried mercy, kindness, hesitation, all the things that slowed her down. Fear had been her only tool, the only way to keep hold of power in a galaxy that respected nothing else. She had convinced herself it was the only way. And for years it had worked. Until now. The human's presence felt like a mirror, one she had not asked for but could not look away from. In him, she saw a reflection of the fire she once carried, the same defiance that had made her rise. But where her fire had turned to fear, his burned clean. That difference terrified her more than the fleet at her borders. The chamber shook again, harder this time. Dust fell from the high ceilings as another impact echoed through the fortress. Soldiers barked orders into comms, their voices cracking under the weight of uncertainty. She forced herself to stand taller, to project the authority she had built her empire on. But she could feel the shift. Authority alone would not be enough this time. She turned to the human, anger finally rising to mask the unease clawing inside her. Do you think your defiance changes anything? You are one. I command millions. I have burned worlds that dared whisper rebellion. You will break like the rest. His eyes didn't waver. Then why haven't you done it yet? Her chest tightened. The words hit too close. Around them, soldiers shifted uneasily. She could feel their attention pulling toward him, their doubt growing heavier in the room. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, her words sharp as blades. You don't understand the cost of defiance. It destroys everything. It leaves nothing but ash. And yet, he said softly, ash is where new life grows. For a moment, she felt her composure slip. Those words weren't just defiance, they were hope. And hope was far more dangerous than rebellion. Hope spread like fire in ways no army could contain. The alarms blared louder, warning of breaches at the outer defenses. Soldiers scrambled to their posts, but she could see it in their faces. They were shaken, not by the invading fleet, but by the human who stood untouched in their midst. She should have killed him. She knew it. But something deeper held her back. A voice she hadn't heard in years whispered that killing him would not silence his defiance. It would only make him a symbol, a story, a spark that spread faster than she could smother. Her thoughts raced. The enemy outside was powerful, but the real danger was inside. Not the human himself, but what he represented. He was the reminder that fear could break. And once broken, it could never hold the same way again. She turned back to the screens, forcing her mind to focus on the immediate threat. The fleet outside was moving with precision, cutting through her defenses like they had studied them for years. Whoever they were, they had not come randomly. They had chosen her, chosen this moment of weakness, and they were striking with purpose. For the first time in decades, she wondered if her empire would survive. Her soldiers waited for her orders, their eyes flicking between her and the human. She raised her hand again, her voice steady as she commanded the counterattack. Ships launched, weapons lit the void, and the first clash of fire filled the stars outside. But even as the battle began, she felt the weight of the human's gaze. He was still watching her, still standing firm. And she knew, deep in her bones, that this battle was not just against the fleet outside. It was against him. Against what he had already begun to awaken. The chamber shook once more, harder than before. The screens flickered, showing flashes of explosions in the void. The battle had begun, and the outcome was uncertain. But one truth lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. The galaxy's most feared warrior was no longer the only one who refused to bow. And the galaxy itself was beginning to notice. As the chaos deepened, she felt the line tighten between her and the human. It was no longer just about defiance. It was about what came next, about whether her reign of fear could survive the one thing she had never prepared for. The human spirit. And though she commanded fleets, armies, and the loyalty of 1,000 worlds, she knew this fight was far from over. The true war had only just begun. The fortress shook as if the stars themselves were tearing apart. Sirens howled through the endless steel corridors, voices barked over comms, and the walls trembled with every impact from the unseen enemy fleet outside. Soldiers ran past the human, rifles in their hands, but their eyes kept drifting back toward him. Even in the chaos, even as destruction thundered around them, he stood steady. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. It was unnatural, infuriating, and yet terrifying all at once. She commanded fleets that could erase planets. Her word had shaped empires. And still, this one figure, unarmed and alone, stood like a stone in a raging current. His calmness was not arrogance, it was conviction. And conviction spread faster than fire in dry grass. She tried to bury her unease in orders. Her voice cut through the chamber, commanding squadrons, directing fire, deploying reinforcements. Screens flashed with streaks of light as her ships clashed with the attackers in the void. For every vessel that fell, 2 more enemies seemed to appear. Whoever they were relentless, and they had chosen their moment perfectly. Her commanders whispered updates, each one heavier than the last. The outer defenses had crumbled. The second line was faltering. She clenched her jaw, refusing to show fear. She had risen from worse before. She had clawed her way to power when all odds stood against her. But deep inside she knew this was different. Because this time the enemy outside wasn't her only battle. The human's presence gnawed at her. Every moment he stood there, unbowed, was a blade against the foundation she had built. She thought of the early days, the years when she had fought not just for conquest but for survival. She had known hunger. She had known what it was to watch her people suffer, their hope bleeding out day by day under foreign rule. That was what had driven her to rise, to seize power, to rule with iron and flame. Back then she had told herself it was necessary, that mercy was weakness and fear was strength. But now, watching the human, she felt the lie unraveling. He reminded her of the part of herself she had buried, the fire that once burned not for domination but for freedom. And the soldiers saw it too. They saw his defiance, his refusal, and it whispered a question into their minds that no command could silence. If one could stand, why couldn't they? The chamber shook harder, a deafening crash rippling through the floor as the fortress's shields faltered. Sparks rained from the ceiling and the massive screens flickered, showing enemy ships breaking through the last defensive ring. Her forces fought desperately, but for the first time she saw doubt in their movements. Fear no longer worked the way it once had. She turned sharply to the human, fury covering her unease. You think this is victory? You think your silence, your defiance, will save you? Look outside. My enemies come for all of us. You will fall with them. But he only shook his head slowly. It isn't about falling. It's about standing long enough to prove fear doesn't rule forever. Her throat tightened. She wanted to shout at him, to end him, to prove his words hollow. But her soldiers were watching. They were always watching. And if she silenced him now, she feared it would not erase his defiance, it would carve it deeper into their minds. He would become more than human. He would become a story. And stories outlast even empires. The fortress shuddered again, worse than before. A violent jolt threw soldiers to the ground, and for a moment, darkness swallowed the chamber as power flickered. When the lights returned, the air was heavy with smoke and the taste of ozone. Reports flooded in, sections of the fortress had been breached. Enemy forces were boarding. Her hands clenched into fists. She had always thrived in battle. War was her element, her stage. But this war was no longer simple. Outside, unknown enemies tore at her walls. Inside, one man tore at the very foundation of her rule. And for the first time in years she did not know which threat was greater. The human's eyes never left her. There was no triumph in them, no mockery. Only something sharper, belief. He believed she could be defeated, and worse, others were starting to believe it too. She barked orders, sending squads to hold the breaches, demanding reinforcements from nearby fleets. Her voice was iron, but she felt the cracks forming under it. Every soldier who glanced at the human carried a spark of hesitation. Every heartbeat she let him live was another heartbeat where fear lost its hold. And then came the moment she dreaded. One of her own officers turned to her, face pale, eyes uncertain. "Commander, should we withdraw?" The words sliced through the air. Withdraw. Her empire had never known that word. Her name had always meant advance, conquer, destroy. But now, in the heart of her fortress, one of her loyal soldiers dared speak it aloud. And when she looked at the others, she saw it. The thought was spreading. Her pulse thundered in her ears. If she allowed retreat, she was finished. If she ordered them forward, they might collapse anyway. Either way, she felt the grip slipping from her hands. She turned again toward the human. He stood in the smoke and flickering light, his face calm, his gaze unwavering. And she realized something terrible. He didn't need to fight her. He didn't need to strike her down. He was winning already without lifting a weapon. The fortress shook with another explosion, closer this time. The walls rattled, dust falling like ash from the ceiling. Somewhere beyond, the enemy forces were breaking through. The tension in the chamber was suffocating. Soldiers held their weapons tight, caught between fear of her and the pull of something greater rising inside them. She felt her throat dry, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't known in decades. For the first time since she had taken power, she stood on the edge, not of battle but of collapse. And the human still hadn't bowed. The silence between them pressed harder than the alarms, louder than the explosions. It was a silence full of unspoken questions, of soldiers waiting, of an empire trembling on its foundations. She knew what came next would decide everything. Her reign. His defiance. The future of her empire, perhaps the galaxy itself. The storm outside grew closer, shaking the chamber with every strike. The enemy was almost upon them. Her soldiers waited, their loyalty cracking, their fear no longer absolute. And in the center of it all, one human stood tall, a living promise that fear could break. She drew in a breath, heavy and sharp. Her next command would shape everything. But before the words could leave her mouth, the chamber doors blew open. And everything changed. The doors tore apart with a sound like thunder, shards of metal scattering across the chamber floor. Smoke and fire spilled in, carried on a gust of cold air from the breached corridors. Her soldiers spun toward the entry, weapons raised, bracing for the invading enemy. But what stepped through was not what anyone expected. At first glance it was human. The shape, the gait, the size. almost identical. But its movements were too sharp, too precise, and its eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light. A dozen more followed behind it, each one marching in perfect unison. Not soldiers of flesh, not rebels, not even mercenaries. They were something else. Machines sculpted in the likeness of humanity. For the first time her composure cracked. She had fought countless species, studied their armies, their weaknesses, their patterns. But this was different. These weren't just machines. They had been designed to mimic the very defiance she feared most. The human in the center of the chamber did not move. He watched them approach, his expression unreadable, but in his stillness she sensed recognition. He knew something she didn't. The machines halted, their glowing eyes scanning the room. Then as one they turned, not toward her but toward the human. And in perfect synchrony they lowered their heads. The chamber went silent. Every soldier froze, caught between fear of her and the chilling realization that these new arrivals had chosen their allegiance. And not to her. Her chest tightened, rage flaring under the weight of something she had not felt in years, helplessness. These machines, these strange creations had not come to conquer her fortress. They had come to kneel before the very human who had already begun unraveling her reign. She took a step forward, her voice sharp, carrying through the silence. "What are they?" The human finally spoke, his voice low but steady, every word striking harder than any weapon. Proof that fear doesn't last forever. Even the machines learned that. Her soldiers shifted uneasily, their faith trembling. The sight of armies outside tearing her defenses apart was one thing. But this cut deeper. Her empire was built on the idea that no one could ever stand against her. Yet here stood not only one human, but now an entire force bowing to him. Her mind raced. This couldn't be coincidence. No fleet chose this exact moment by chance. No army of machines just happened to arrive here now. Someone had planned this. Someone had waited for her grip to loosen, for her fear to surface. And they had chosen this human as the spark. The chamber shook again, the fortress buckling under another barrage. Sparks lit the ceiling, smoke thickened the air. Outside, her fleet bled against an enemy she could not see clearly. Inside, her soldiers wavered between her command and the growing weight of the human's silent defiance. And now the machines stood, their glowing eyes fixed on her, waiting. Not to attack, not to retreat, but to challenge her power without lifting a weapon. She felt the walls closing in. Her empire was under siege from every side, by enemies in the void, by defiance in her halls, and now by something worse, the collapse of belief itself. Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. "Do you think this changes anything?" she hissed, her voice breaking for the first time. "You think you've won because you stand here and stare at me? You are one man. One. I command worlds, armies, power you cannot imagine." The human met her rage with silence, and somehow that silence screamed louder than her words. The machines didn't move. Her soldiers didn't move. The entire fortress seemed to hold its breath. Then softly he spoke. "It isn't power that lasts. It's defiance." The words hit her harder than the enemy's weapons pounding her fortress. Her empire had been forged on fear, but fear was fragile. And now, standing in her own command chamber, she felt that fragility like glass cracking under pressure. She wanted to strike him down. She wanted to shatter his defiance before it spread further. But her soldiers' eyes were on her, their doubts rising. If she killed him now, he would not die. He would live forever as a story, a symbol, one they could never erase. The fortress shook again, harder than before, nearly throwing her from her feet. Reports screamed over the comms. Inner defenses had collapsed, boarding parties were advancing. Time was running out. And then she saw it. One of her soldiers, standing at the edge of the chamber, lowered his weapon. Just slightly. Barely noticeable. But it was enough. A ripple ran through the others, doubt spreading like fire in dry fields. Her empire was slipping, not from the outside, but from within. She forced her voice through the smoke and fear. "Stand your ground. Obey your commander." But even as she shouted, she knew the truth. Her voice no longer carried the same weight. Not with the human standing there. Not with machines bowing before him. Not with her empire burning outside. The storm was closing in from all sides, and for the first time she did not know if she could weather it. The doors shuddered again, and another wave of explosions shook the fortress. The enemy was almost at the chamber. She had seconds, maybe minutes, before everything collapsed into fire. And still the human stood. Silent. Defiant. Unbroken. She looked at him and knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that the true battle was not out there in the stars. It was here now, in this chamber. Between her fear and his defiance. between an empire built on power and a spirit that refused to bow. And as the doors cracked under the weight of the coming storm, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The human wasn't just standing against her. He was leading the beginning of something she could not stop. The chamber trembled, the soldiers wavered, the machines waited, and the enemy pressed closer. Everything was teetering on the edge, one breath away from breaking. And the galaxy's most feared warrior felt, for the first time in her reign, that she might already be losing. The doors finally gave way, exploding inward in a storm of sparks and fire. Figures poured through, armored warriors in dark plating that glimmered with an unfamiliar insignia, their weapons glowing with energy so sharp it cut the smoke itself. Her soldiers turned to meet them, but hesitation lingered in their movements. Shots rang, blades clashed, and the fortress chamber erupted into chaos. She raised her weapon, her instincts sharpened by years of conquest. For a heartbeat, she was the warrior she had always been, commanding fire, striking with deadly precision. But something had changed. For the first time, her voice didn't carry absolute obedience. Her soldiers fought, but not with the same ferocity. Their loyalty had cracked, their fear diluted. And at the center of it all stood the human, unshaken, his presence anchoring every heart in the room, even those who had once followed her without question. The machines moved too, their precision terrifying as they cut through the invaders. But they did not fight for her. Their protection was for him. And every time she looked at the human, she saw the truth. He didn't need to command them. His defiance commanded itself. The invaders pushed forward, their formation unbreakable, their power overwhelming. She realized they had not come to destroy the fortress, they had come for her. Not to conquer the galaxy's strongest empire, but to end the reign of fear at its very heart. Her chest heaved as she fought, as her blade clashed against theirs. But even as she cut them down, her thoughts churned. She had ruled by making others bow, by crushing hope, by smothering every flame before it could spread. Yet here now, in her most desperate hour, she felt the weight of all those choices crashing down upon her. Because fear could not hold forever. The human finally moved. Not to fight, not to kill, but to step forward into the chaos. Soldiers and machines alike made space for him, their eyes drawn as though gravity itself bent around his presence. He walked straight toward her, steady, unbroken, even as the battle raged around them. For a moment time slowed. She saw him as he was, fragile, mortal, easily destroyed. And yet, he carried something more dangerous than any weapon. He carried belief. He carried defiance against power itself. Her breath caught as he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the strain in his eyes, the sweat on his brow, the fire that refused to dim. The fortress shook again, another explosion ripping through the walls. The world was collapsing and still he stood. "You can end this," he said, voice raw but steady. "Not with fear. Not with fire. With choice." Her blade trembled in her hands. Choice. The word cut deeper than steel. Choice was what she had taken from everyone, forcing surrender, forcing obedience, forcing fear. And now, standing in the ruins of her own making, she was faced with it herself. Behind her, her soldiers faltered. Some lowered their weapons. Some dropped them entirely. They were watching her, waiting, not for command but for something more. The machines bowed again, their glowing eyes locked on the human. The invaders paused too, sensing the shift in the chamber, their weapons hesitating mid-strike. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence she understood. Her empire was already broken. Not by weapons, not by fleets, but by the one thing she could never control. Defiance. Her grip on the blade loosened. It fell to the floor with a sharp clang that echoed louder than any explosion. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Soldiers froze, stunned. The human didn't move, his eyes fixed on hers. And then, slowly, she bent her knee. The galaxy's most feared warrior, the one who had ruled by terror, lowered herself before the man who refused to bow. A silence deeper than space itself fell across the chamber. Her soldiers stared, disbelieving. The machines stood motionless. Even the invaders paused, their formation breaking, unsure of what they had just witnessed. She bowed her head. For the first time in her life she admitted it, to herself, to them, to the galaxy. Fear could no longer rule. But just as the air shifted, just as it seemed the battle had ended, the final twist revealed itself. The human staggered. His hand pressed to his chest, his breath shuddering. Blood stained his shirt, unseen until now. Somewhere in the chaos he had been struck. He swayed, and for a moment the fire in his eyes flickered. "No," she whispered, shock tearing through her. The machines surged forward to steady him, their movements almost frantic, as though they could not allow the symbol they served to fall. But he raised a hand weakly, stopping them. His gaze found hers, steady even as his strength failed. "It was never about me," he said, his voice breaking but clear. "It was always about them. About everyone who chooses to stand." And then his legs buckled. He collapsed into the arms of the machines, his body trembling, his fire burning low but not extinguished. Her chest tightened painfully. She had bowed to him and now he was fading. Yet in the silence that followed she realized the truth. His words had already taken root. His defiance had already spread. Around the chamber her soldiers dropped their weapons one by one. Not in surrender but in something else. In choice. In freedom. In defiance against fear. The invaders lowered their blades too, confusion flickering in their ranks. The machines stood tall, holding the human like a banner that could never be torn down. And she, once the galaxy's most feared warrior, felt the weight of something she had never known. Not fear. Not power. Responsibility. The war outside still raged. The fortress still burned. But inside, in that chamber, the galaxy shifted. Because one human had refused to bow, and in doing so, he had made even the strongest bend. She looked at him, broken but unyielding in the machine's arms, and for the first time, she whispered the words she had sworn never to speak. "You've already won." The alarms screamed, the stars burned, the empire crumbled, but defiance lived. And in its echo the galaxy would never be the same again. The silence after the battle was almost heavier than the clash itself. For so long, the galaxy had lived under the weight of fear, the kind that made entire civilizations bow their heads without question. Now that silence was broken not by screams or weapons, but by the slow breath of relief that spread across worlds. She, the one who had ruled the stars with fear, had finally been brought to her knees, not by an army, not by a machine, but by one human who refused to bow. At first no one believed it. The fleets that had trembled at her command sent out desperate messages, their voices echoing disbelief. The colonies she had subjugated lit beacons into the dark void, not sure if they were free or if this was just another cruel trick. Even her own soldiers, bred on loyalty and terror, stood still, unable to grasp that their invincible leader had been undone. And at the center of it all, that human stood, weary but unbroken. His body carried the marks of the struggle, blood, bruises, exhaustion, but his eyes carried something greater. They carried the truth that power built on fear was not unshakable, that defiance against power was enough to break even the strongest chains. He hadn't fought for glory or conquest. He had fought because he refused to kneel, because to kneel was to accept that fear would always rule. Her defeat didn't erase the scars she had left. Entire planets bore the memory of her rule, cities turned to dust, families torn apart, generations who knew nothing but her shadow. In the days that followed, the galaxy began to rebuild, but rebuilding was not simple. The people argued. Some wanted vengeance against those who had served her, others wanted forgiveness to prevent more cycles of hate. Old wounds surfaced, and the galaxy teetered between healing and falling apart again. The human found himself at the center of those arguments. They looked to him as if he were a savior, as if he had all the answers. But he was only one person and he knew it. When asked how he did it, how he defeated the one no one else dared to challenge, he would say the same thing in a voice quiet but steady. I just refused to bow. It was not strength that had carried him through. It was not superior weapons or numbers. It was the simple truth that the spirit of humanity, the unstoppable human spirit, could endure what others thought impossible. And in that endurance, in that refusal to surrender, something greater had been born. But even as peace slowly stretched across the stars, shadows lingered. Her empire had been vast, and though her throne was empty, fragments of her power remained. Loyal warlords scattered across sectors still whispered her name, refusing to believe she was gone. Some called her death a lie, claiming she would return. That fear had not yet vanished, it clung to the edges of the galaxy like smoke after a fire. One night, as he stood staring at a ruined world where survivors had just begun to plant crops again, a child approached him. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, his eyes older than his years. He asked a question no one else dared. Were you afraid? The human crouched down, looking into those eyes that had seen too much loss. He answered honestly. Yes. I was afraid every step of the way. The boy frowned. Then how did you win? He smiled faintly, a tired smile. Because fear only controls you if you let it. I was afraid but I didn't bow to it. That's the only reason I made it this far. That truth spread more than any broadcast or declaration. Some pitied her, some raged that she had used her suffering to justify inflicting suffering on others. For the human, it was not sympathy he felt, nor hatred, it was something more complicated. He saw in her the proof of what he already knew: fear was a chain. Could twist even the innocent into tyrants. That final twist left the galaxy with one last choice. Would they repeat her mistakes, letting fear guide their hands? Or would they follow the example of the one who had refused to bow, even when fear pressed hardest against him? Slowly the answer began to take root. Planets opened their doors to one another. Former enemies met not with blades but with words. It wasn't perfect, peace never was, but it was real and it was growing. The human did not claim a throne, nor did he accept power. When offered command of fleets, he refused. When told he could be the galaxy's new ruler, he simply shook his head. Asterisk, I fought so no one would kneel again. If I take a crown, then I've undone everything. Asterisk. Instead, he wandered, helping where he could, leaving behind not an empire but a legacy. And everywhere he went, his presence was a reminder. He wasn't taller than others, nor stronger, nor immortal. He was simply human. And that was enough. Generations would tell the story. Parents would whisper it to their children before sleep. Teachers would repeat it in classrooms. Leaders would invoke it when they faced impossible odds. They would remember that there was once a ruler who commanded the stars through fear, and that she fell because one human refused to bow. And in that memory, they would find strength when their own nights grew dark. They would hold on to the unstoppable human spirit, the one thing no empire, no tyrant, no shadow could ever truly crush. In the end, the galaxy did not heal all at once. Scars remained, and they always would. But the scars became a reminder, not of weakness but of endurance. Proof that even in the face of the most feared warrior the stars had ever known, defiance against power had carried the day. The human never asked to be remembered. But he was. Not because he conquered, not because he ruled, but because he showed what it meant to stand when standing seemed impossible. And that was how fear lost its throne.